The ballroom was dressed like a victory lap. Crystal glasses caught the light, the company logo glowed behind the stage, and every conversation hummed with the comfortable confidence of people who believed they were standing inside a success story. It was our 20th anniversary, a number my parents loved to repeat, as if saying it out loud could turn time into proof. I moved through the room unnoticed, which wasn't new, but that night it felt intentional. No place card with my name near the front, no introductions, just polite smiles from people who knew me only as someone who happened to be there. When my sister stepped up to the microphone, the room leaned in. She had practiced this. Her posture was perfect, her voice warm and steady as she talked about growth, vision, the next chapter. Then she said it, as casually as if she were announcing a new logo. From today on, she would take full control of the company. And I, she added, would no longer have a role, a clean cut, efficient, final. Applause filled the space, glasses lifted. Someone laughed like this was the most sensible thing they had heard all night. I felt the sound hit me before the meaning did. Years of quiet work reduced to a sentence, erased with a smile. I didn't argue. I didn't react at all. I simply turned my head and looked at my mother. "So, who will be legally responsible?" I asked. Her wine glass slipped from her hand and struck the table with a sharp crack. The applause died mid-breath. Conversation stalled. For a long second, no one moved, and in that silence, I understood something had just shifted. Not because I had accused anyone, but because I had asked the wrong question at exactly the right time. The silence didn't break cleanly. It fractured. People glanced at each other, unsure whether to keep smiling or look concerned. My sister's expression froze in a way I'd seen before, the moment when confidence has to decide whether to harden or retreat. My father stared at the floor like it might offer an answer. My mother didn't look at me at all. She reached for a napkin with hands that suddenly seemed unsteady. I stayed where I was, calm in a way that surprised even me. I hadn't planned to speak that night. I had come knowing I would be erased, but also knowing that silence would make me complicit. The question had been sitting in my chest for weeks, waiting for a moment when it could no longer be ignored. My sister cleared her throat and tried to recover the room. She talked about transition plans, about advisors, about how everything was under control. The words sounded right, but they floated without anchoring to anything real. A few people nodded, but others didn't. A man near the bar stopped mid-sip and frowned, the way people do when a puzzle piece doesn't fit. Someone asked if there would be a formal announcement about the leadership change. Another asked who would be signing off on compliance going forward. These weren't hostile questions. They were practical ones, the kind that follow any real shift of power. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The assumptions were doing the work for me. My sister tried to laugh it off, brushing it aside as an administrative detail that didn't belong at a celebration. That was the mistake. You can call many things administrative, but risk isn't one of them. Responsibility doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient to discuss in front of champagne flutes. I watched the room change, not dramatically, not with shouting or accusations, just a subtle tightening, a collective sense that the story they'd been handed was missing a chapter. People who had been impressed a moment ago now looked thoughtful. The music started again, too loud for the mood, and the party tried to move forward, but it never quite did. I felt a strange clarity settle over me. This was the point of no return, not because I had embarrassed my family, but because I had refused to carry a burden without a name anymore. Whatever happened next, the illusion that everything was fine had cracked, and cracks have a way of spreading. By the end of the night, clusters of guests stood in low conversations, voices careful, eyes alert. The celebration hadn't ended in disaster, but it hadn't ended in triumph either. I slipped out early, unnoticed again, except this time the invisibility felt different. Lighter. To understand why that single question landed the way it did, you have to know what I had been doing long before that night, back when my role didn't have a title, and my silence was mistaken for loyalty. To understand why my absence mattered, you have to go back to when it was first invited. Not announced, not documented. Invited, like a favor you're supposed to be grateful for. I was the youngest, the one still trying to be useful without being in the way. When my parents asked me to take a quick look at a contract years ago, it felt harmless. A second set of eyes, family helping family. I didn't think of it as a role because they didn't want it to be one. I had the background for it. Enough legal training to spot problems, enough patience to translate dense language into plain consequences. The first document I reviewed had a clause that could have exposed the company to penalties if a partner missed a deadline we didn't control. I rewrote it, sent it back, and thought that would be the end of it. Instead, another document appeared a week later. Then another. Each one came with the same framing. Can you just help us with this? You're good at catching things. It became routine without ever becoming official. Files sent late at night, calls that started with apologies for bothering me and ended with relief when I fixed what everyone else had missed. I wasn't CC'd on threads. My name didn't appear on anything final. If something went wrong, it was corrected quietly before it could be noticed. That was the point. The better I did my job, the less visible it became. Publicly, the company looked clean and confident. My sister spoke at meetings, led presentations, shook hands with partners who never learned my name. She had the title, the authority, the spotlight. Behind the scenes, decisions moved faster than they should have, and paperwork lagged behind ambition. That gap was where I lived. I flagged risks. I adjusted language. I warned when timelines didn't align with reality. I told myself I was protecting the family, not enabling them. There was one deal early on that still stands out. A vendor agreement rushed through to meet a launch date signed by someone without proper authority. If it had been challenged, it could have turned into a public dispute. I caught it 2 days before the deadline, rewrote the approval chain, and sent it back with instructions. The problem disappeared. No lawsuit, no fallout. Just a quiet thank you and an unspoken expectation that I'd be there the next time. That was how my value was measured, not by acknowledgement, but by absence of disaster. When nothing happened, it meant I had done my work. When something did happen, it was assumed I hadn't been looped in yet. The irony was sharp. I was essential precisely because I wasn't seen. As my sister's authority grew, my position stayed undefined. She spoke for the company. I cleaned up after it. She made decisions that sounded bold in a room full of people. I made sure those decisions didn't explode once the room emptied. We didn't argue about it. There was no open rivalry, just a widening gap between who was credited and who was relied upon. I started to notice the language my parents used. You're such a help. We couldn't do this without you. We'll make it official someday. Someday is a convenient word. It sounds generous while postponing everything that matters. I accepted it because pushing back felt selfish. Because I believed that loyalty would eventually be recognized. Because I didn't want to be the one who made things uncomfortable. The first time I felt truly uneasy wasn't dramatic. It was a missing line on an internal document, a version I'd never seen before. A small thing, easy to explain away. But it lingered. I realized then that being useful didn't make me secure. It made me optional. I could be called in when there was a problem and left out when there wasn't, and no one would think twice about it. I told myself it was temporary. That structure would come later. That families didn't need contracts between them. That silence was the price of peace. What I didn't see yet was how silence can be mistaken for consent, and how quickly consent can be withdrawn without notice. By the time the anniversary planning began, the pattern was set. I was holding the framework together without being part of it. I didn't know then that the invisibility I had accepted so easily would be used as justification to erase me completely. But the groundwork had already been laid, quietly, efficiently, the same way I had been working all along. A few weeks before the anniversary, the tone changed. Not suddenly, not in a way you could point to and name, but enough that I started paying closer attention. Things I normally saw before anyone else were moving past me. Contracts closed faster, decisions were announced as done instead of discussed. The quiet rhythm I'd grown used to felt off, like a machine running without one of its stabilizers. The first red flag was small. A draft agreement crossed my screen by accident, forwarded from someone who assumed I was still part of the review process. I scanned it out of habit and felt my stomach tighten. The language was sloppy, timelines vague, authority implied where it didn't exist. It wasn't catastrophic on its own, but it was the kind of thing that stacks. One loose clause turns into leverage, one assumption becomes a liability. I replied with comments, careful and neutral, and never heard back. Then it happened again. Another deal, another set of terms that skipped the safeguards I usually insisted on. This time I wasn't copied at all. I heard about it in passing, someone mentioning it like a success story already wrapped up. I asked a question, gently, about whether legal had signed off. The answer was a shrug disguised as confidence. Leadership is handling it. That phrase followed me for days. Leadership is handling it. As if leadership were a person instead of a process. As if risk dissolved the moment someone with a title nodded at it. I felt the familiar pull to step in, to clean it up quietly before it mattered. But something held me back. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the growing sense that my involvement was being tolerated only when it was convenient. The email that really changed things arrived late one afternoon. I wasn't supposed to be on it. I could tell from the tone, the shorthand, the way people spoke freely without explaining context. It was about expansion, restructuring, a shift in how decisions would be made going forward. My name wasn't mentioned once, not as a contact, not as a safeguard, not as a problem. What caught my eye wasn't the omission, it was the assumptions. They were talking about authority as if it had already been reassigned, about responsibilities as if they could be redistributed without consequence. Someone dismissed a potential exposure with a line that made my jaw clench. We've never had an issue with that before. That was only true because I had been there. I called my mother that evening, not angry, not accusatory. I framed it the way I always had, as concern. I asked if there were changes I should know about, if my role had shifted. She laughed softly and told me I was reading too much into things. "You worry more than you need to," she said. "Everything's fine." When I asked about the specific risks I'd seen, she grew impatient. "Your sister knows what she's doing. We trust her." The conversation ended the way so many had before, with reassurance instead of answers. I hung up feeling smaller than I had when I dialed. My sister stopped calling after that. When we did speak, it was formal, efficient, stripped of the easy familiarity we'd once had. She talked in conclusions, not conversations. Decisions had already been made, paths already chosen. The confidence she projected felt brittle up close, like something that needed silence to survive. A week later, a more serious issue surfaced, a compliance matter that couldn't be brushed aside with optimism. I spotted it through a back channel, a question from someone external who still associated my name with that part of the business. The fix wouldn't be simple. It would require cooperation, transparency, and time. All the things that had been in short supply lately, I sat with it longer than I ever had before. I weighed the consequences of stepping in against the consequences of staying quiet. For the first time, I saw the trap clearly. If I fixed it, I would be reinforcing the idea that my role was optional, my labor assumed. If I didn't, the risk would move forward unchecked, and the fallout would be real. That was the moment something shifted inside me. I realized that my silence had been taken as approval, my availability as obligation. They weren't moving without me by accident. They were preparing to move without me permanently. The confirmation came quietly. One morning, I opened a shared folder I'd maintained for years and found it gone. No warning, no explanation. Just a polite error message, as if access had never existed at all. It wasn't emotional. It was administrative. And that made it unmistakable. This wasn't a misunderstanding to clear up over coffee. It was a plan unfolding. And for the first time, I understood that whatever was coming at the anniversary wasn't a surprise announcement. It was the final step of something already decided. By the time the anniversary invitations went out, I stopped asking myself whether I was being pushed aside. The question had shifted to how deliberately it was being done. Nothing dramatic happened. No meeting, no announcement. Just a series of small removals that added up to absence. Access disappeared first. Shared folders I'd organized and maintained for years returned polite error messages. Calendars that once showed review deadlines went blank. Documents I would normally see in draft form arrived finalized, their language locked in place without my input. It felt surgical. Each change small enough to deny, together impossible to ignore. I learned about a leadership meeting after it happened. Someone mentioned it casually, assuming I'd been there. I hadn't. The agenda, I later found out, included decisions that carried legal exposure, the kind that should have raised red flags immediately. Instead, they were treated as momentum, progress measured by speed rather than stability. I tried once more to talk to my parents, not to accuse, not to demand anything, just to understand. I asked if my role had changed, if there was something I should know. The answers were familiar. You're overthinking. This is just growth. Things evolve. No one said I was wrong. They just refused to say I was right. What finally crystallized it wasn't family at all. It was an external call. A consultant who'd worked with us before reached out, asking for clarification on a clause I'd handled in the past. He spoke easily, assuming continuity. I had to tell him, carefully, that I was no longer authorized to advise. There was a pause on the line, the kind that comes when someone realizes a system has a gap. That gap was the problem. I hadn't been replaced. I'd just been removed. The company was moving forward as if the safeguards I provided were optional, as if authority could be reassigned without consequence. No one had updated the outside world. No one had thought through what happened next. I sat with that realization longer than I wanted to. The instinct to fix it tugged at me, strong and familiar. I could step back and quietly patch the hole, protect them from themselves one more time. But something in me resisted. Every silent fix made the next erasure easier. Every uncredited rescue reinforced the idea that my presence was temporary. My responsibility assumed, but never acknowledged. So I stopped. I didn't announce it. I didn't threaten or warn. I simply withdrew. When questions came my way, I redirected them. When issues surfaced, I let them surface. It wasn't revenge. It was boundaries, drawn too late, but finally drawn. The final confirmation came by accident. I saw a draft of the anniversary program passed along by someone who didn't realize how much it would reveal. Names, titles, acknowledgments, a polished narrative of 20 years of success. My name wasn't there, not even as a footnote. The future they were presenting didn't include me, and it never had. I felt an unexpected calm settle in. Hurt, yes, but also clarity. They weren't confused about my role. They had decided it was no longer necessary, at least not publicly. The work I'd done had been absorbed into the background, its value measured only by the absence of problems. That was when I understood the announcement wasn't a risk. It was a formality. The erasure had already happened in quieter ways. The stage was just where they planned to make it official, counting on my silence to smooth the transition. I didn't confront anyone before the party. I didn't demand explanations or force a conversation they weren't ready to have. I let the night approach on its own terms. If they wanted to tell a clean story, they could. I would let it unfold. The only thing I promised myself was this: I would not keep protecting a structure that refused to name me. I would not carry responsibility without authority or loyalty without respect. If the truth was going to surface, it would do so in its own time, not because I pushed it, but because I stopped holding it down. When the night arrived, I walked into the room knowing exactly where I stood, invisible by design, excluded by plan, and finally unwilling to pretend that any of it was accidental. The applause faded unevenly, like a song ending without a clear last note. People smiled because they were supposed to, hands still raised with glasses half full, waiting for the next cue. My sister stood at the center of it all, confident, composed, already moving past me as if the announcement had settled everything it needed to settle. From her perspective, it probably had. She talked about momentum, about clarity, about the importance of decisive leadership in a changing market. The words were polished, familiar, the kind you hear at every milestone event. She framed the shift as efficiency, as progress, a necessary evolution. When she mentioned me again, she did it lightly, without malice, as if removing me were a technical adjustment rather than a personal erasure. I stayed quiet, watching the room instead of her. I could see who was listening and who was calculating. The investors who leaned back, weighing risk. The partners who nodded out of habit, then paused. The advisors who didn't clap at all. This wasn't the audience she thought it was. Not entirely. For a moment, I considered letting it pass. Silence would have been easy. It would have kept the night intact, the story clean. I understood the cost of speaking here, in front of people who mattered to the company, people who would remember every word long after the champagne was gone. But I also understood something else. If I stayed silent now, the narrative would harden around my absence, and there would be no way back from it. I didn't look at my sister when I spoke. I turned toward my mother instead. It wasn't a performance. It was instinct. She was the one who knew how things really worked behind the scenes, the one who had called me late at night when problems threatened to surface. My voice came out steady, almost polite. "So who will be legally responsible now?" I asked. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The effect was immediate. My mother's wine glass slipped from her fingers and struck the table, the sound sharp enough to cut through the room. The applause died mid-motion. Conversation stalled. Someone near the back laughed nervously, then stopped when no one joined in. My sister turned toward me, her smile tightening. She said something about advisors, about processes already in place, administrative details, not something to get into tonight. She tried to move on, to pull the room forward by force of confidence alone, but the question had landed where it needed to land. A man I recognized from a prior deal cleared his throat and asked, carefully, who would be signing off on compliance going forward. Another mentioned that they'd been working with me on risk review and wondered who their point of contact would be now. These weren't challenges. They were assumptions colliding with reality. I said very little. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't volunteer explanations. I let the confusion surface on its own. Each follow-up question widened the gap between the story being told on stage and the structure underneath it. My sister's responses grew sharper, less patient, She treated the concerns as interruptions, not warnings, and that made people uneasy. The room shifted in small, telling ways. People stopped clapping altogether. A few stepped aside to speak in low voices. The music restarted, too bright for the mood, and only emphasized how off-balance everything felt. What was meant to be a celebration had turned into something else, something unresolved. I realized then that they had never planned for this moment. Not because they hadn't anticipated my reaction, but because they hadn't anticipated accountability. They assumed removing me would be enough, that whatever I carried could be reassigned without consequence. They hadn't replaced me. They had just erased me from view. My sister finally tried to shut it down, thanking everyone for their support and suggesting we enjoy the rest of the evening. The microphone was lowered, the light softened, and the party attempted to resume. But the energy was gone. Conversations broke into tense clusters, smiles forced, eyes alert. I felt a strange calm settle over me. I hadn't accused anyone. I hadn't revealed secrets or aired grievances. I had asked a question they couldn't answer publicly without admitting what they'd been avoiding privately. That was enough. As I made my way toward the exit, no one stopped me. A few people watched, curiosity replacing indifference. Outside, the air was cool, the noise of the room muffled behind heavy doors. I took a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The night hadn't exploded the way people imagine confrontations do. It had fractured quietly, efficiently, under the weight of a single unanswered question. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever happened next would no longer be protected by my silence. The fallout didn't arrive with headlines or angry messages. It crept in quietly, the way real consequences usually do. The morning after the party, my inbox filled with polite questions disguised as follow-ups, clarifications, next steps. Nothing accusatory, nothing dramatic, just professionals trying to understand a structure that had suddenly stopped making sense. Advisors wanted to know who would be handling reviews I'd always handled. A partner asked for written confirmation of authority that had never been questioned before. Someone else requested documentation I knew didn't exist because I'd been the one compensating for its absence. Every question traced the same invisible outline, circling a role that had been removed without being replaced. My family reacted faster than the outside world. The calls started before noon, voices tight, words overlapping. They wanted to know what I had said, what I had implied, why things felt different now. There was urgency, but no apology. Anxiety, but no acknowledgement of how we'd gotten here. They asked for help the way people do when they're used to getting it, as if the arrangement were still intact. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer solutions. For the first time in years, I let the discomfort sit where it belonged. When they pressed for reassurance, I kept my answers factual and brief. I wasn't withholding out of spite. I was no longer compensating for decisions I hadn't made. My sister tried to regain control the only way she knew how. She reassured people publicly, framed the concerns as temporary confusion, insisted everything was under control. She spoke confidently, but the confidence rang hollow. Each attempt to smooth things over raised more questions, not fewer. Treating structure like optics only works until someone asks for proof. The real escalation came when an external inquiry landed, formal and unavoidable. A routine review, delayed just long enough to intersect with the leadership shift. It required documentation, timelines, signatures. It required history. The kind of history I'd been carrying in my head and my files for years. They reached out to me out of habit, assuming continuity where there was none. I responded carefully, explaining that I no longer held the authority they were asking for. The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. It wasn't anger. It was concern. Inside the family, the tone shifted again. The conversations grew sharper, edged with blame disguised as confusion. How did this happen? Why is this coming up now? Questions aimed anywhere but inward. At one point, someone accused me of abandoning them. The word landed hard, familiar, and unfair. That was when I finally understood the full shape of the problem. I hadn't been removed because I was unnecessary. I'd been removed because I was inconvenient. I asked questions. I slowed things down. I insisted on clarity where they preferred comfort. Erasing me simplified the story until the story collided with reality. There was a meeting I agreed to attend, not to fix anything, but to be present. It was tense and circular, full of half admissions and defensiveness. They wanted guidance without conceding authority, answers without accountability. I stayed calm, stating facts without cushioning them. The contrast between their urgency and my steadiness only seemed to heighten the tension. I felt the pull to step back into the familiar role, to stabilize the situation and absorb the stress. The instinct was strong, but I recognized it for what it was, a reflex built over years of being the quiet solution. If I stepped in now without boundaries, nothing would change. The cycle would reset, and I would disappear again as soon as the crisis passed. By the end of that week, it was clear the company stood at a threshold. The issues surfacing couldn't be ignored or smoothed over. Someone would have to take responsibility, not just for outcomes, but for decisions. Pride and survival were pulling in opposite directions, and the space between them was narrowing. I watched it all unfold with a strange mix of distance and clarity. This wasn't about punishment. It was about exposure. Once the silence broke, the structure had to stand on its own. And for the first time, I wasn't holding it up from underneath. I knew the next move wouldn't be mine alone. They would come to me, not with apologies, but with calculations. The question was no longer whether they needed me. It was whether I would agree to step back into a system that had already shown me how easily it could erase me. They came to me a few days later, not all at once. Not with an apology, but with the careful language people use when they're trying to regain control without admitting they've lost it. The crisis had shifted from panic to calculation, and I could feel the weight of it in every word they chose. This was no longer about the party. It was about survival. The first conversation was framed as concern for the family, for the company, for everything we'd built together. No one mentioned how I'd been erased, how my role had been dismissed in front of a room full of people. The assumption was clear. We would move forward without reopening old wounds. I would help because I always had. I listened without interrupting, letting the shape of the request become obvious. They didn't want me back in any formal way. They wanted my knowledge, my memory of past decisions, my ability to navigate risk, all without changing the structure that had pushed me out. Help us get through this, and then we'll see. Someday again. That was when the internal conflict surfaced, sharper than before. Part of me wanted to stabilize the damage, to stop the bleeding before it became irreversible. I'd spent years doing exactly that. But another part of me, quieter and more stubborn, recognized the trap. If I stepped in without clarity now, I would be confirming that my boundaries were negotiable and my erasure forgivable. They presented an offer that wasn't really an offer. A vague role, temporary authority, private assurances that things would be different this time. No written acknowledgement, no ownership of how decisions had been made. Just trust us. The words felt familiar and empty. I realized then that this wasn't about reconciliation. It was about control. They wanted the comfort of my presence without the inconvenience of my voice, and I couldn't pretend not to see it anymore. When I finally spoke, my tone surprised them. It wasn't angry. It wasn't emotional. It was precise. I laid out my conditions calmly, one by one. Defined authority, clear responsibility, Full disclosure of existing risks, not promises, structure. The room went quiet in a way that felt very different from the silence at the party. The reaction was immediate and telling. Shock first, then defensiveness. Accusations slipped in, dressed up as concern. That I was being cold. That I was making things harder than they needed to be. That family shouldn't need contracts to work together. I didn't argue. I had already done that work internally. My sister reacted the hardest. I could see the threat register in her posture, the way she bristled at the idea of shared authority. Control had always been her language, and she wasn't fluent in anything else. The realization settled heavily between us. For the first time, they understood that I wasn't negotiating emotionally. I was deciding. There was a long pause, the kind that comes when people realize the dynamic has shifted and they don't know how to pull it back. In that space, I made my decision. I chose self-respect over approval. I chose clarity over comfort. Whether I stepped back in under my terms or stepped away entirely, I would not return to silence. I told them I would not act informally again. If they wanted my involvement, it would be visible, documented, and respected. If not, I would remain outside the structure and let it stand or fall on its own. There was no threat in it, just fact. The future of the company hung unresolved when the conversation ended. So did the future of my relationship with them. I felt the loss in a way I hadn't expected, not sharp, but heavy. Choosing boundaries often means choosing distance, at least for a while. As I left, I understood something clearly. Silence had kept the peace for years, but it had also allowed the imbalance to grow. Speaking up hadn't fixed everything, but it had stopped the erosion. Whatever happened next would be built on truth, or it wouldn't be built at all. The reckoning was no longer abstract. It was personal, structural, unavoidable. And for the first time, the choice ahead felt like mine. Months passed, and the noise settled into something quieter and more honest. The company didn't collapse, but it didn't glide forward untouched either. It slowed. Advisors were brought in, documents were reviewed line by line. Decisions that once happened on instinct were forced into daylight where they had to survive scrutiny. Progress became deliberate instead of performative, and that alone changed everything. The structural changes were unavoidable. Authority had to be defined. Responsibility had to be named. The company could no longer pretend that confidence was a substitute for process. None of that happened because I demanded it. It happened because once the silence ended, the truth had room to breathe. What had been hidden in the margins became impossible to ignore. My sister struggled the most with that shift. Without the protection of appearances, her leadership was tested in ways it never had been before. Some days she rose to it. Other days she pushed back, frustrated by limits she hadn't believed applied to her. There was no villain arc, no dramatic downfall, just the slow realization that control without understanding comes with a cost. My parents changed too, though it took longer. Losing the illusion of harmony was harder for them than losing anything else. They had spent years protecting the image of a seamless family business, convinced that acknowledging cracks would make them real. Now they were learning that denial had nearly done more damage than honesty ever could. Acceptance came in pieces, uneven and imperfect, but it came. As for me, my life grew quieter in the best way. I no longer carried invisible responsibility. I no longer woke up bracing for problems that weren't officially mine to solve. Whether I was involved or not, the terms were clear. No more late-night fixes, no more silent rescues. If my work had value, it would be named. If it didn't, I would walk away without guilt. The strangest part was the relief. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Relief. I hadn't won by taking anything from them. I had won by refusing to keep carrying what was never mine to begin with. The space that opened up once I set that boundary felt unfamiliar at first, then necessary. I thought often about how easily silence is mistaken for weakness, especially when it comes from someone who has always been reliable. People assume you will always absorb the pressure, always smooth the edges, always keep things running. They rarely ask what it costs you to do so. And when you stop, even quietly, the reaction can be shock instead of understanding. That's the part I want you to sit with. If you've ever been the one holding everything together behind the scenes, fixing problems no one wants to acknowledge, you know how tempting it is to keep going just to preserve peace. You know how hard it is to speak when speaking means disrupting a story everyone else is invested in. My revenge, if you want to call it that, wasn't loud. It wasn't destructive. It was choosing truth over comfort, clarity over approval. It was letting consequences belong to the decisions that created them. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back and stop correcting the record for other people. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated or erased because your work made others comfortable? Did you stay silent to keep the peace, or did you choose a moment to speak up? Share your experience in the comments. These conversations matter more than you think, and if you want to keep hearing stories like this, stories about quiet strength, family dynamics, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to shout, consider staying with us. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and come back for the next one. You're not alone in this, and sometimes the truth only finds its voice when we share it together. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.